Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week, we're marking a rather special occasion, the 25th anniversary of the UBS Optimus Foundation. The foundation works with many charities running successful local programs across some of the most challenging parts of the world. Building meaningful partnerships that drive impact is at the core of the Optimus approach. In this special edition of the show, we're going to hear about the importance of collaboration in delivering effective philanthropy, with a particular focus on education, a theme of such profound importance when it comes to driving social equality and development. Education is one of 4 areas of focus for the foundation alongside health, climate and the environment, and humanitarian aid and disaster philanthropy. On the show, we're hearing from Tom Hall, Global Head of Social Impact and Philanthropy and CEO of the UBS Optimus Foundation Network. And also from one of the partners and collaborators who've already been driving change and impact, Fabio Segura, co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation, a Swiss-based organisation dedicated to promoting child and youth development globally, particularly through research, education and initiatives that support learning and cognitive development. We'll hear more about the work that both these innovative foundations have done, are doing, and have in the works to continue to ensure that they're driving transformational impact. So, a fascinating conversation ahead, and a warm welcome to Tom and to Fabio. Tom Hall, a warm welcome back to the programme. You're a proper regular on the Bulletin. It's great to have you with us. Let's start with this important marker. It's an auspicious time, the 25th anniversary of the Optimus Foundation. Remind us about its origin story, first of all.
It was really set up to try and support this growing asset class, if you like, of philanthropy, of entrepreneurs in particular, generating exponential wealth creation that we've seen in that time period. And we know that 90% of high net worth individuals globally are engaged in some form of philanthropy. And then within that, there's a lot of question marks about how you can make that philanthropy effective. How can you actually address some of the big social and environmental problems that we all are passionate about and want to use those resources as catalytically as possible to have the most impact you can. And Optimus was really just set up to try and answer that question for our clients, bringing the rigor of financial services to the philanthropic and not-for-profit sector, and really bringing expertise and due diligence and all of those kinds of things that you might expect in the fund management process to the selection of, really high impact. Traditionally, people might say charities. I think post-rationally now we try and talk about impact unicorns, whether it's a social enterprise or a charity or even a business that can actually drive impact into the billions. And over the years, we've built out that capability set and we've seen a huge amount of demand. Clients want this service and we have deep expertise in the areas where we feel are the fundamental building blocks to addressing those big social environmental issues and building a world where everyone can prosper. So we have expertise in health, ensuring that people actually survive and thrive, in education, which is actually critical right from early years through to tertiary, so that people can have the skills they need to be able to contribute economically and ultimately grow our economies. Meeting the Sustainable Development Goals can add 12 trillion to the global economy. This isn't about just doing the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. It's doing the right thing to do because it's beneficial to all of us. And more latterly, we've started to focus quite a lot on the environment and conservation. Again, it's a big problem. Many of our clients wanted support in identifying the right things to do there. So again, we built up that capability. And I suppose, in the nature of my title, Optimus Foundation isn't actually just one foundation anymore, although it started in Switzerland. It's now soon to be 8 different legal entities all over the world to enable effective philanthropy from a tax perspective, as well as then directing capital into some of these really high impact solutions.
And I guess, Tom, one of the great delights of the many that you get as you help to build partnerships, drive this really progressive agenda, and then actually track the impact is building incredible long-standing partnerships. And of course, we've got Fabio stood alongside you, co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation. And Fabio, Tom mentioned education there. That's a particular focus, isn't it, of the Jacobs Foundation? Just tell us a little bit about the work that you do and the background, of course, established back in the late 1980s, I think I'm right in saying, from the coffee roasting dynasty. But tell us a bit about Jacobs Foundation and what they exist to do and how you spend your day to day.
Absolutely. In 1989, when Klaus Jacobs created the foundation, he had just been exposed to the science of early learning. So what happens in our brains when we're 0 to 5 years old. And he thought, this is fascinating and it's fantastic, but it's not applied in schools. And so our original theory of change was if we invest in more research, if we avail that research, policymakers and practitioners are just going to jump at it and they're just waiting for more research to come and to be published so they can integrate it. And with the years, our theory of change changed itself to integrate what actually is translating that evidence, making it available to policymakers and to practitioners. And so that what happens day to day in schools is evidence-based. So what we do today and our mission is to bring evidence to education policy and practice. And we spend our day speaking with scientists about the frontiers of research, speaking with policymakers about the efficacy of policy and the scalability of interventions, and speaking to schools leaders and teachers about how to apply this in practice in schools around the world.
Well, I'd like to ask you both about how the partnership, we can see that how these two lenses that you both have overlay so elegantly through the work of Optimus Foundation. Talk to me a bit about the power of this partnership, this collaboration specifically, well, and I guess also more generally in philanthropic terms, at delivering tangible impact. Tom Hall, I'll come back to you first of all. We know that when problems exist on this scale, partnerships and collaborations must be deep. Talk to us about how it works in this case.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think for us, in fact, we had our 25th anniversary celebration last night, and the panel, which Fabio was an absolute star on, was called The Power of Partnership. And it's all about working collaboratively together. And for us, just at a very existential level, we recognise, and I think our clients do too, that philanthropy is not enough to solve the big social and environmental issues the world's facing, even though Forbes estimates it's going to go to 10 trillion by the mid-2030s, up from 2 trillion today. Huge growth in the amount of capital being deployed to attempt to address these issues. But the solutions to those problems are estimated at anything between 30 to 50 trillion if you're looking at, transition to net zero. Global education, for example, to provide a scholarship to every single young person who might deserve one to get that tertiary education that can increase their income afterwards by 10 times would cost $60 trillion. So the models that we have today aren't going to work. We have to innovate. We have to find new ways to address these issues and then scale them up. And that, by definition, means that there's only a handful of potential kind of unicorn type ideas that we need to amplify, make people aware of, and drive capital into. So what we're obsessed with at the Optimus Foundation is finding those partnerships. We only approve about 5% of the organizations that apply to be an Optimus partner. And I think, the meeting of the minds that we've had with the Jacobs Foundation has got a very long history in terms of our outlook, how we view the world, how we view the need for systems change, how we see that ultimately all routes to scale have to be in collaboration with government in some form or other, whether that's about policy change or ultimately about the sustainability of funding in the long term. So I think we've tried to build a portfolio of things we recommend to our clients in those 3 dimensions I mentioned earlier, but we don't believe we have a monopoly of great ideas. In fact, we know our clients have often invested in those great ideas, and it's up to us to try and find those and then amplify them and bring them to our clients. So I think in the case of our partnership with the Jacobs Foundation in particular, looking on, really transforming education in a whole country, in this case in the Côte d'Ivoire, that was right up the strategy that we wanted to do ourselves, but they had already done a lot of the hard work. We're like, absolutely, we want to partner with you, we want to come alongside you, we want to add our resources, we want to bring other clients in. How can we serve you to make this as successful as it can be?
Yeah, and Fabio, talk to us a little bit again about what these kinds of partnerships can unlock. Obviously, some lovely celebratory occasions like last night that Tom mentioned, but on a serious level, I guess scalability critical. And when you have these sorts of partners in the team, you can move so much faster and with so much more ambition in scaling terms.
I think the time when foundations could afford to do a project and call it their impact was a luxurious time of plenty of capital laying around and the challenges still being manageable at that level. But society has evolved to think that the result of a good intervention shouldn't be another intervention. It should be a systems change. And when you think at that scale, you have to come up with solutions that match the scale of the problem or challenge that we want to address. And that requires a lot of experimentation because we don't know everything that works to achieve SDGs. It's not just a matter of pouring more capital into a solution that is already tested and proven and rolling it out. It's figuring out. It's messy. It's trying to understand where we need to invest capital that perhaps will yield no results, but knowledge about what not to do next time around. And you require a very strong partner that believes in a very long-term goal and believes in an entrepreneurial way of getting there, but especially believes in the power of thinking differently and bringing different perspectives into figuring out how to do that experimentation in a rigorous manner. So when we started working in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, we had the cocoa and chocolate industry, we had the Optimus Foundation join us, and we had the government all trying to figure out what is it necessary to do in this country to do a two-fold approach, which on one hand would increase the quality of education and on the other hand would help the industry address the challenges of child labor. So that is politically very complex, and in terms of interventions, it's a design that requires a lot of experimentation and a lot of trial and error in a responsible manner, of course, but sort of like coming back from having a perfect project that you can just put out in the year end and thinking about systems transformation. What do you require to do as partners in order for the underlying dynamics of this problem to change and shift?
Well, yeah, you've both mentioned Côte d'Ivoire, and I think it's always instructive for our audience to look at the nuts and bolts of a specific project. And let's talk a little bit about the child learning and education facility there. Well, maybe, Fabio, we'll dig into some detail about what that looks like in a second. But I guess, Tom, from your point of view, it's important to look at what exists behind the need for that solution, right? And perhaps we should talk a bit more specifically about the financing gap in education, especially in lower and middle income countries. You already provided some points on that, but you can't really overstate, can you, the problem that is presented by that financing gap?
Yeah, and I actually really agree with Fabio on this. I think it's not just a question of a money gap, as if we find the money, the problem's solved. I think it's actually a problem of really being focused on the right things. So I'll give you a tangible example from a neighbouring country in Ghana. We had the Minister for Education telling us that, they've had 20 years of investment in their education system. Money from their own budget, money from the World Bank, all of these, bilateral funding. And the KPIs around that funding was building schools, training teachers, and printing textbooks. And they deliver those KPIs brilliantly. The schools look great. The teachers were trained but didn't necessarily implement the training perfectly, and that's not uncommon. And the textbooks, because the KPI was to print them, not for them to be used and to lead to learning outcomes, often just stayed in warehouses. And what the minister was saying is, in 20 years, the learning levels had not increased. And this is like a fundamental problem, because if people are not learning what they need to learn in order to become socially and economically independent, then you're not going to see economies grow, right? So this idea of GDP growth is inextricably linked with a functioning, successful education system. And we've seen that, by the way, in Southeast Asian countries where we've seen huge growth, which has driven actually many of the new clients and philanthropists that I happily work with. So if you don't actually have a functioning education system, you need to fix that system. And as kind-hearted as it is, and as well-meaning as it is, setting up a school for 1,000 kids that helps those 1,000 kids is great for those kids, but it's not systemic. It's not going to lead to great educational outcomes for millions of children across an entire population that will then lead to that GDP level effect. So ultimately, I think what this is about is coming up with educational interventions, whether that's pedagogy, how kids learn, sometimes left field things like medication and school meals, all of these different factors that can contribute to ensuring a child learns, and then tracking that and making sure that that's the outcome that's being measured. And when we start to do that, we can actually prove progress, and then capital can flow into that progress and start to scale it up. And that is what essentially the Clef-Elam partnership was looking to do across a whole population in a whole country all at once. It was a hugely ambitious idea and not without risk. And I think that's the other core thing here with partnerships. It's about people trusting each other to take risks. And as Fabio said, it's messy. It's definitely not going to always go to plan, but you hold the course, you course correct quickly because you're judging against data, not against belief, and you keep progressing and improving, and actually hopefully what you arrive at is not just something that works in one country, but that can maybe be replicable to others as well. And of course, it's never going to be a complete cookie cutter approach. There's always nuances, but you have that in mind as well.
Well, yeah, Fabio, can I ask you a bit more about Clef then? I think Tom set that up very elegantly. There has to be a higher risk appetite, and that's often enabled by having potent partners in the space. But tell us a bit about Clef and why it's worked, and some of the, the metrics by which you can sort of prove that.
So in Côte d'Ivoire, what we set out to do was to increase learning outcomes. And the first thing we started doing with our partners was to look at a number of interventions. In fact, we looked at more than 3,000 interventions that could be applicable in the context we were addressing. So together with the government, we pre-selected a number of those interventions that seemed aligned with policy and culturally viable. With the industry partners then, those are the Coke and chocolate industry, we started testing these models along their supply chain communities where they had worked for decades and knew the variables that needed to be controlled in order for those interventions to be delivered in a legitimate manner. However, some of these interventions proved to be inefficient. Some of them proved to not yield results according to plan. And so through a test and trial and error process, ultimately the government, the industry partners and the philanthropy partners decided to focus on a subset of 5 interventions out of all of these tested. With these 5 interventions in mind, we tested for scalability and sustainability. Can the government finance any of them at scale and cover the entire country? And the objective there was to reach 10,000 rural schools, which equates to the entire rural population of schools. And we landed in 1 intervention. Once this was done, then the partners committed significant capital together with the government to roll this out in all schools in rural Côte d'Ivoire. And with this partnership, we sit together in a steering committee where government, industry, and philanthropy decide on how to deal with implementation challenges, how to deal with results that are coming from external independent evaluators, and how to correct course in order for the partnerships to achieve the objectives of quality education improvements.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you both about, we are sort of marking so many successes, this 25th anniversary. And there are many reasons, of course, to be optimistic, successes to point at. But what has that 2.5 decades, Tom, told you about where we need to do more and move further and faster? Is it about even broader collaborations? Is it about navigating the always thorny issue of so many different stakeholders, possibly with different agendas and different time horizons for their measurements of success? What has the experience told you about things that we still need to work together to do even better?
Well, the first thing I think it's told me is that you do have to be optimistic. You have to believe that you can address these kinds of issues, and you then have to be realistic about what that will take in terms of collaborating with others, about having the right people around the table. And as I said, you can't solve no single organization can solve an issue. It is always a collaboration. And the more that you can be intentional about pulling the right partners around the table to really focus on what are the outcomes they're trying to drive and think through how you can do that, then the more likely you are to be successful. So number 1 is that partnership point for us. Number 2, I think that it's critical, is really challenging ourselves to try and use capital in the most efficient way possible, right? We already know that donations are great. They're good for testing things and innovation. But ultimately, if you're going to get to scale, you've really got 3 routes. One is form of policy change, but by definition that then tends to lead to some form of government expenditure, which, as we all know, is not necessarily always rational and efficient and spending money on the right things, right? So there's a systems change part to that. So dialogue with government and really thinking about how we can help governments make better decisions. I mean, governments globally spend about $32 trillion a year. That is where the sustainable funding is for things like healthcare systems and education systems. So the more that we can partner with them to ensure that they're really getting value from that expenditure, the better. So I think that's another critical piece. And then thirdly, innovation on the investment side as well, because that's the other part of how we can drive scale. So we've seen other models, not in the case of Clef, because that's a partnership with government, but where we can use capital to invest in solutions that work that traditionally would have been grant-based. So I mentioned tertiary education and the need for $60 trillion using the existing model to provide the funding needed to get to all of the 500 million young people globally the tertiary education that they deserve. That model needs to be changed, right? And that's something we're actively doing. So alongside working on the primary school system, we're also looking at financing tertiary education. But there, instead of having this kind of traditional model of tying up capital and giving out scholarships, we're lending money directly to students in these really rural settings. And what we're seeing is a 95% repayment rate. We're seeing them go on to, massively increase their income, sometimes in the space of just 6 months. And that's about using those philanthropic resources much more efficiently. So it would only require about $500 billion of lending, fair price student financing, to ensure that all that 500 million student could go to college and go on and get that tertiary education that they need. And that's a fairly radical idea, but it's also something that is totally deliverable. We can find mechanisms that can pool capital in more efficient ways. And the other area that we're talking about, in fact, we were just talking about, is use of assets, right? So it doesn't even need to be an investment or a donation. It can just be things like loan guarantees, whether that's a guarantee to a government or a guarantee to an operating organization, just allowing them to get fairer price financing, lower price financing. In the context of student financing I just mentioned, the average cost of a student loan for a young woman in Rwanda or Sierra Leone or Cote d'Ivoire is probably about 40% APR. I mean, none of us want to take that debt on, right? That's crippling. Yeah, if you can use innovation around, different types of financing, whether blended finance or guarantees, you can bring that down to a much more sustainable price that means many, many more students can benefit.
Well, yeah, and Fabio, let me sort of put that question to you then, or rather, let me respond to Tom's remarks there and ask you this. Are you optimistic? You've tracked so many hugely innovative and successful initiatives. I'm sure there have been the fair share of setbacks along the way, but do you remain optimistic that these kinds of initiatives, partnerships, collaborations, and this commitment and conviction about innovation in the space will get us where we need to go in time, despite the urgency?
There is no other way to work around these topics. There's simply no possible scenario in which one single stakeholder, without entering into partnerships that are complicated, complex, and rich in perspectives and approaches, can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason why I'm optimistic is because whenever you calculate the gap in funding for any of the SDGs, UNESCO, for example, believes that the gap to fund SDG 4 in education, the Sustainable Development Goal in education, is about 100 billion per year. But that calculation is wrong. And it's wrong because it just assumes that we know what the solution is, and it's a matter of pouring the capital into it and rolling it out. When in fact, we know more about what doesn't work than what works. The good news is that by large, a lot of the things we know don't work get a lot of the funding. So if we just correct for that, if we think collectively, if we use the different approaches of the private, public, and philanthropic sectors to address the stubborn challenges, that gap could be halved. And that's why I remain optimistic that these partnerships that are only starting to pick up speed as we speak are the best way to address this collective international community approach to SDGs.
That was Fabio Segura, and before him, UBS's Tom Hall, bringing us to the end of this edition of The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Head to ubs.com and search Optimus Foundation to read more about all the amazing work and partnerships being driven by Tom and his colleagues. And it's jacobsfoundation.org to find out about the work Fabio was describing and to learn more about getting involved. As ever, you can listen again and explore more at monocle.com or follow this programme wherever you get your podcasts. And to discover more and find out how UBS can help you, head to ubs.com. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.